In the winter of 1942, a handful of decisions made inside a frozen bunker came within a breath of changing the borders of every nation on Earth. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, literally. And most of you have never been told the full story, not because the records don't exist, not because historians haven't studied it, but because the truth is too uncomfortable to carry inside a national myth. The Allies nearly lost World War II. Not almost didn't win. Nearly lost. That distinction matters more than you've been allowed to understand. And the reason it's been softened, reframed, and quietly buried inside triumphalist narratives is exactly what this documentary is going to expose. This is what History Unlocked was built for, not to give you the clean, comfortable version with the obvious heroes and the predetermined ending, but to hand you the version that was slowly erased by politics, pride, and the passage of convenient memory. If you've never subscribed, this is the moment it becomes necessary, because what follows is not a war story. It is the story of how close civilization came to something genuinely unthinkable, and why that truth has never been given the weight it deserves. So ask yourself this, before we go any further: if one man's gamble had paid off, if 7 days of decisions had gone slightly differently, what would the world you're living in right now actually look like? Hold that question, because by the time this is over, you'll understand exactly how real it was. By the spring of 1942, Adolf Hitler was not losing. That is the first thing history tends to rush past, and it is the most important foundation for everything that follows. In June of 1940, France, the nation that had bled Germany white in the First World War, the nation with the largest standing army in Europe, the nation that British military planners had assumed would absorb the German blow for years, collapsed in 46 days. Not months, days. The psychological shockwave of that collapse was total. Churchill later admitted in private correspondence that in the immediate aftermath, he genuinely did not know if Britain would survive. The royal family had evacuation plans in place. The Bank of England had moved its gold. The British Expeditionary Force, the professional corps of the entire British Army, had been chased off the continent at Dunkirk, abandoning nearly all of its heavy equipment on the beaches. Hitler stood in Paris on June 23, 1940, hands clasped behind his back, doing a small, involuntary jump of elation in front of the Eiffel Tower. A man who less than 2 decades earlier had been sleeping in Viennese homeless shelters and selling watercolor paintings on street corners, now the most powerful military figure in Europe. But that triumphant image conceals a terrible irony, because it was precisely in that moment of apparent total victory that Hitler began making the decisions that would ultimately unravel everything. The terrifying part, the part that should keep you engaged until the final frame, is how extraordinarily close those decisions came to succeeding anyway. By the summer of 1942, the Third Reich controlled territory stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the suburbs of Moscow, from the Arctic coastline of Norway to the burning desert corridors of North Africa. The combined population under Nazi occupation exceeded 300 million people. German industrial output dwarfed anything Britain could sustain independently, and the Soviet Union, Hitler's defining Eastern obsession, was hemorrhaging in ways that defied comprehension. By the autumn of 1941, German forces had captured or killed over 3 million Soviet soldiers. 3 million! In under 5 months! Cities built across generations were reduced to rubble in days. The Soviet government had secretly relocated to Krivoshev, 600 miles east of Moscow. And Stalin himself, the man who would later be cast as the immovable defender of the Russian people, according to NKVD records declassified decades after the war, briefly considered a negotiated armistice with Germany. Stalin considered surrendering. Why he didn't, and why that decision haunts military historians to this day, is a thread we'll return to. But first, you need to understand the battle, because in the spring of 1942, Hitler made the most strategically audacious gamble of the entire war. And it wasn't the invasion of the Soviet Union that had already happened. This was something different, something more targeted, more coherent, and far more dangerous than the popular narrative ever acknowledges. He called it Fall Blau, Operation Blue. The goal wasn't Moscow. It wasn't Leningrad. It wasn't the theatrical capital city campaign that dominates popular imagination. The goal was oil. Hitler had done the arithmetic. Germany's war machine ran on petroleum, and by 1942, Fuel reserves were critically strained across every theater of operations. The Romanian fields at Ploiești were producing, but nowhere near enough for a two-front war with expanding commitments in North Africa and the Atlantic. But in the Caucasus region of southern Russia, in Baku, in Maykop, in Grozny, sat some of the most productive petroleum reserves on the planet. Fields that had been pumping since the 1870s. Fields that, if captured, would hand Germany energy independence for a generation. And there was a second dimension to this calculation that made it genuinely brilliant. If Hitler seized those Caucasus oil fields, the Soviet war machine would be simultaneously starved of the same fuel that had kept the Red Army fighting. Soviet tanks would stop. Soviet aircraft would be grounded. Soviet logistics, already stretched past their rational limits, would disintegrate. This was not the raving of an ideological fanatic divorced from military reality. Multiple post-war analysts, British, American, and Soviet, have assessed Operation Blue as strategically sound, which is precisely what makes the next 12 months of history so profoundly disturbing. Because here is the question that serious military historians have never been able to fully set aside. If Hitler's generals had been given complete operational authority, if they had been allowed to execute the plan as designed, without his catastrophic late-stage interference, would it have worked? The honest answer, based on the available evidence, is that most historians who have studied the campaign in depth believe it would have. Sit with that, because what comes next depends on you understanding that this was not a fantasy. It was a viable path to Axis victory. The city on the Volga was not originally a primary objective of Operation Blue. Stalingrad, named for the Soviet leader himself, a fact that made it psychologically impossible for either side to disengage, was designated as a flank-securing action. Army Group B would push to the Volga River, neutralize the city as a rail and resupply hub, and protect the northern corridor for Army Group A's drive into the Caucasus oil fields. It was supposed to be a supporting maneuver, a tactical objective in service of a larger strategic goal. Instead, it became the hinge point of the entire war. By August of 1942, German forces had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, one of the most formidable fighting formations in the history of modern warfare, began pushing into the city itself. What followed was unlike anything industrial warfare had produced before that moment. Urban combat in Stalingrad descended into something almost medieval in its intimacy and brutality. Streets changed hands multiple times in a single day. Soldiers fought for individual floors of burned-out apartment buildings. Snipers turned rubble fields into killing corridors where life expectancy for a Soviet rifleman was measured not in weeks but in hours. The Germans had a word for it: Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. And here is what history consistently glosses over. For much of the autumn of 1942, Germany was winning it. General Vasily Chukov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army inside the city, later admitted in his memoirs that there were multiple distinct moments when he genuinely believed his forces would be annihilated. His headquarters was overrun repeatedly. His command staff was shelled, burned out, and relocated so many times that coordination approached total collapse. The Soviets were not holding the line. They were clinging to the edge of it by individual acts of desperate, often suicidal resistance, by soldiers crossing the Volga under direct artillery fire in the darkness, reinforcing positions that were already half destroyed before they arrived. One soldier, a sergeant named Yakov Pavlov, took a handful of men, fewer than 30 in total, fortified a 4-story apartment building, and held it against continuous German assault for 58 days. 58! Chukov would later say that more German soldiers died attempting to capture Pavlov's house than were killed in the entire German conquest of Paris. Let that proportion settle for a moment. Let it tell you something about what this battle actually was. And now ask yourself something that has no easy answer. If you had been ordered across that river, if you had stood on the eastern bank and watched the city burning on the other shore, if you had known the casualty rates, known the odds, known what was waiting for you in those ruins, would you have gone? Or is the honest answer something harder to say out loud? November 19th, 1942. That date should be as permanently embedded in American historical memory as D-Day, as instantly recognizable as Pearl Harbor. And yet most people in this country could not tell you what happened on that morning. That silence, that specific, deliberate absence from public memory is a significant part of what History Unlocked exists to correct. Because on November 19th, 1942. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, and it did not merely change the battle for Stalingrad, it changed the trajectory of the entire war, while global attention remained fixed on the brutal, grinding urban combat inside the city. Soviet planners under General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky had been quietly, methodically assembling one of the most ambitious encirclement operations in the history of modern warfare. They had identified something that German military intelligence had catastrophically, almost inexplicably, failed to account for: the flanks. On either side of Paulus's Sixth Army, to the north and to the south, Hitler had positioned Allied forces to guard the long corridor into Stalingrad. Romanian armies, Hungarian divisions, Italian corps, many of them soldiers of genuine courage and dedication, but equipped with light anti-tank weapons, positioned in thinly stretched defensive lines across hundreds of miles of open, frozen steppe. They were not capable of stopping a full Soviet armored thrust, and Zhukov knew it with absolute certainty. In 4 days, 4 Soviet armored columns smashed through both flanks simultaneously and linked up behind the Sixth Army. The encirclement was complete. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped inside a freezing pocket with dwindling supplies and no viable exit. The most powerful single fighting formation in the entire German order of battle had been surrounded. And here is the moment that history moves past too quickly, because it is genuinely uncomfortable to remain inside it. Hitler had been warned, not once, repeatedly. His own senior generals, Zeitzler, Richthofen, Paulus himself, had begged him to authorize a breakout while it was still operationally possible. In the early days of the encirclement, the Sixth Army still had fuel, still had tactical mobility. A fighting withdrawal would have been costly, perhaps catastrophically so, but it was survivable. The army could have been saved. Hitler refused. He called the encirclement a temporary difficulty. He promised that Göring's Luftwaffe would supply the pocket by air, a promise that his own logistics officers and Göring's own staff understood to be physically impossible given the tonnage requirements and the Soviet air defenses steadily closing around the corridor. Everyone at the senior command level knew it was impossible. They said so, in writing, through the proper channels. Hitler declared Stalingrad a fortress to be held at all costs. And with that single decision, in that single meeting, he condemned 300,000 men to death or Soviet captivity. Of the soldiers trapped in that pocket, only around 6,000 would ever return to Germany, most of them not until the mid-1950s. A full decade after the war ended. This is the moment, this specific, documented, historically verifiable catastrophe of leadership that most World War II narratives know briefly and then move past. They acknowledge the defeat. They call it a turning point. They provide the statistics. What they do not do is sit inside the human weight of it. The fact that it was not inevitable. That it was a choice. That a different decision made in a different meeting could have preserved an army and plausibly altered the strategic balance of the entire Eastern Front. This is exactly the kind of history that gets smoothed over when nations build their myths. And it is exactly the kind of history that History Unlocked will not allow to disappear. The real version, the one where the outcome was never guaranteed, where the margin between the world we have and the world we almost had was measured in specific decisions made by specific people under impossible pressure. That version deserves to be told fully and without apology. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment to understand why it matters. There is another layer beneath this that rarely surfaces in popular accounts. The German generals who survived the Eastern Front, men who later wrote memoirs, gave testimony, and submitted to Allied interrogation, almost universally identified specific, concrete moments when the war could have been stabilized or won, and almost universally, they traced the failure of those moments to Hitler directly overriding his professional military staff. General Erich von Manstein, assessed by many serious military historians as the most gifted operational commander of the war on any side, spent a significant portion of his post-war memoir documenting precisely how Hitler's intervention transformed strategic opportunity into catastrophe, decision by decision. At Stalingrad specifically, Manstein commanded Army Group Dawn and developed a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, designed to punch through Soviet lines and either resupply or rescue the trapped Sixth Army. His armored spearhead drove to within 30 miles of the encircled pocket before being halted by Soviet resistance and overstretched supply lines. 30 miles. Paulus's men inside the pocket could hear Manstein's artillery. They knew relief was close. But Hitler refused to authorize Paulus to break out and drive toward the relief force. He insisted the 6th Army maintain its frozen positions. And Manstein's column, denied the link-up it needed to sustain the operation, was eventually forced to withdraw as Soviet pressure intensified along other sections of the front. The 6th Army was left to die. So place yourself in Friedrich Paulus's position for a moment. You are a field marshal. Hitler promoted him the day before his capture. A psychological maneuver. Since no German field marshal had ever surrendered, and you can hear the guns of your relief force 30 miles away, you know that breaking out against direct orders might save 300,000 lives. You know that following those orders condemns them. What do? Do you follow the chain of command? Or do you decide that there are moments when obedience itself becomes a form of moral failure? Paulus followed orders. He surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, in the basement of a ruined department store, gaunt and frostbitten, the last senior German commander to lay down arms in Stalingrad. The psychological calculation Hitler had made by promoting him that no field marshal would accept the disgrace of surrender failed. Paulus surrendered anyway. After Stalingrad, Hitler had one remaining window, one more moment where the Eastern Front might plausibly have been stabilized, not reversed. The losses were too severe for that, but held in a defensive posture sufficient to force a negotiated settlement before Allied industrial capacity made the outcome mathematically inevitable. That window opened in the summer of 1943, at a Soviet salient centered on the city of Kursk. The Germans had identified the salient correctly. If they could pinch it off with a classic armored encirclement, they could destroy an enormous concentration of Soviet forces and potentially anchor the southern portion of the Eastern Front. The plan was operationally sound. The forces assembled for it were among the most powerful Germany could still field. And the Soviets, through one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the entire war, the Lucy Network, operating out of neutral Switzerland, drawing on sources that historians still debate, received detailed advance warning of the German plan, its timing, its objectives, and its specific lines of attack. Zhukov and Vasilevsky used that warning to construct the most comprehensive defensive architecture the war had yet produced. Hundreds of miles of layered trenches, dense minefields, anti-tank ditches, pre-registered artillery zones calibrated to funnel German armor into killing grounds. They built a trap, and they waited for the Wehrmacht to walk into it. On July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel began. Nearly 900,000 German troops, close to 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft drove into Soviet defenses that had been specifically designed to absorb and destroy them. The Germans were stopped. The fighting at Prokhorovka on July 12, hundreds of tanks engaging at near point-blank range in swirling, chaotic close combat remains one of the most savage single-day engagements in the history of armored warfare. But the offensive failed to achieve its objectives. And then, on July 10, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Hitler, confronting a new crisis in the Mediterranean, pulled forces from the Kursk battle to address it. The last German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front was called off. From that moment forward, the Wehrmacht in the East was executing a retreat, sometimes skillful, sometimes desperate, but always a retreat, and always in one direction. The question that remains, the uncomfortable, historically documented question, is whether a different sequence of decisions made 12 months earlier could have prevented this entirely. The answer, based on what the records show, is that it very possibly could have. Be precise about what that means. Hitler did not almost win through ideology. The racial framework of Nazism was, among many other things, a strategic catastrophe. It alienated populations that might have supported or remained neutral toward a German military presence, motivated enemies to fight with a ferocity they might otherwise not have sustained, and produced decisions of almost incomprehensible irrationality at critical moments. He almost won through conventional military power, applied at extraordinary scale, by a fighting force that was, in its prime years between 1940 and mid-1942, arguably the most sophisticated combined arms military organization the world had yet produced. In the summer of 1942, if Operation Blue had been executed with the operational discipline its architects intended, if the Caucasus oil fields had fallen before Soviet defensive preparations consolidated, if Stalingrad had been masked and bypassed rather than assaulted directly, if the vulnerable flanks of Army Group B had been strengthened with German rather than Allied divisions, the strategic landscape of the entire war changes. A Germany drawing energy from the Caucasus. A Soviet Union simultaneously starved of the same oil. Allied landings in North Africa arriving to a very different strategic reality. History does not turn on isolated moments, but it turns on clusters of decisions, on nodes where one choice opens certain futures and forecloses others. In the summer and autumn of 1942, those nodes existed. They were real. They were identifiable. The decisions made at them, by Hitler, by Paulus, by Stalin, by Zhukov, are the reason the world looks the way it does today. The most unsettling conclusion that serious historical analysis of World War II produces is not that evil was powerful. It is that victory over it was not predetermined. It required every element of the chain to hold. Every drop of Soviet blood in the Stalingrad ruins, every convoy that survived the Atlantic crossing, every intercept from Bletchley Park, every decision that happened to land correctly at the moment it mattered most. Remove any single element, and the chain breaks. That is not the story told at memorial services. It is not the narrative constructed in museum exhibitions or network miniseries, but it is what the evidence actually shows. The reason this history remains partially hidden is not coordinated suppression. It is something more human, and in certain ways more troubling. Nations build narratives that sustain them. They emphasize the evidence that confirms what they need to believe, that democratic values prevail, that the moral arc of history bends toward justice. That victory was always coming because it had to come, and there is a specific, geopolitically inconvenient dimension to this particular story. The country that absorbed the overwhelming weight of defeating Nazi Germany, that lost an estimated 27 million people, military and civilian, compared to approximately 405,000 American dead and 450,000 British Empire dead, became, within 4 years of the war's end, America's primary strategic adversary. It is psychologically impossible to simultaneously present a nation as both the salvation of civilization and its greatest existential threat. So the narrative adjusts, subtly, consistently, over decades. The Eastern Front becomes a backdrop, the Soviet sacrifice becomes a footnote, and the story of how close Hitler came to winning the war gets quietly, methodically softened until it no longer carries its true weight. The 27 million Soviet dead are not a footnote. The operational logic of Operation Blue is not a curiosity. The decision to leave 300,000 men to freeze and starve in a Volga pocket when a breakout was still possible, and the decision by individual soldiers to hold their positions in that pocket until there was nothing left to hold, these are not supporting details in someone else's story. They are the story. And the difference between the sanitized version and the full version is not merely academic. A world that does not understand how contingent its own survival was is a world that cannot fully appreciate what was preserved or what it still stands to lose. The men who died at Stalingrad deserve more than a paragraph. The decisions that nearly broke the world deserve more than a passing reference in a chapter about the turning of the tide. If the people who lived through the winter of 1942, who held those ruined buildings, who crossed that burning river, who heard the relief guns 30 miles away and followed their orders anyway, if they had known exactly how thin the margin was, how close the world they were fighting for came to simply ceasing to exist, would they have chosen differently? Or is that precisely why no one told them? Some of history's most important truths aren't buried beneath the ground. They're buried beneath the stories we tell ourselves so that we can sleep at night. History Unlocked exists to bring them back to the surface and to make sure they are never smoothed over again.